Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I am so thrilled today to have somebody with me that I have wanted to talk to for years, literally years. This is a person who has shaped much of my work with her phenomenal research. She's one of the leading experts in the world on bonding hormones. And you know what? I think she's a little bit of a personal hero of mine as well. I think this conversation will go great. This is Dr. Carter here today, and she's going to be talking to us about her phenomenal research. I need all of you to listen very, very closely because this work, this research, this information needs to be known everywhere. It is an important piece of the conversation for us fixing our society in a best way, building forward into a place that supports love and intimacy and connection. And you know what? Makes the world a better place for all of us. So, Dr. Carter, I am glad that you are here today with me. Is there anything you would like the audience to know about you or your work right off the bat?
Well, it's a passion. My work is, I'm going to, on my next birthday, I'll be 80 years old. And I work just as hard today as I did 50, 60 years ago, because what I do to me is very important.
To me too, to be honest with you. I came across your work years ago, and the way that happened was I was a licensed marriage and family therapist. I worked in a clinic working with low-income families and at-risk families, and most of them not only hadn't understood many of the skills growing up, but they had these relationship behaviors that were not appropriate for healthy, fulfilling connections with people. And over time, I came to understand something called attachment theory, which is how we form connections to other people and our families, our caregivers. I think you know this. What really connected me to your work was I started hearing about this thing called oxytocin. People called it the love hormone. I couldn't find much information about it except that it was important and we needed some of it. And it made us kind of happy and connect to mom when we were children. But as I stumbled across it, I remember just Googling what is oxytocin and what does it have to do with love. And one of your research papers was the first thing to pop up. And I was so glad it did because I went through it. It was one of the longest research papers I had ever read in my life. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the name I think was Oxytocin and Vasopressin Bonding Pathways in the Context of Love and Fear, I believe was the title of it. Is that right?
Probably that's what I talk about all the time.
I'm totally with you. I read it and I remember I immediately jumped on my Twitter page and started saying, guys, this is it. This is the answer. And I started posting just like pieces and then trying to translate it for the lay people on Twitter. And people just went nuts. They said, how is this real? What is vasopressin? What does this mean? And they ate it up and they couldn't get enough of it. So I went over and I went over onto TikTok and I started trying to teach people over there and saying, okay, there's this bonding hormone we haven't heard about much, probably. It's called vasopressin. And people, the internet caught on fire. I had 300 followers, but I got 5 million views on that one video, just trying to teach women about, hey, if you're in a relationship with a man, you might want to think about this thing called vasopressin. This might be kind of important. You should probably do this. And the women on TikTok they were starving for information about bonding. They've continued to eat it up now. So the five of the biggest videos here on my YouTube channel are about vasopressin bonding and how that can happen. Much of it drawn from your work. So everybody out there, you've heard me say her name a million times. Can you give us maybe just a brief overview of what is vasopressin from the work that you've been doing? What does that mean?
Well, there's actually a system that has oxytocin and vasopressin in it. The system with both of those molecules is roughly 400 million years old. So this is not news in a biological sense. This is antiquity. And what that has taught us, if you look at oxytocin first, which is where I mostly started, you're going to see a lot of things about attachment, pair bonding, mothering, all of which look pretty good, okay, pretty simple. But because oxytocin was added on top of this more ancient molecule called vasopressin, it's it's really not possible to understand one without the other. Now, you can open up the internet and find people who would give you the impression that they understand oxytocin and that it's easy, it does all these great things. But if you don't realize how this came to be, how it evolved, and how important the two molecules are together, you miss a lot of important, I guess we'll call them nuances, subtleties that are, I think, really critical to human behavior. So we can take it from there, Adam, whatever aspects of this.
I completely agree with you. And I will say there are so few people talking about vasopressin on the internet that I was a little embarrassed. I read your paper and I could not find hardly anybody else talking about vasopressin at all. So
Mm-hmm.
I had to go on Google and type, how do you pronounce vasopressin? And it told me vasopressin. So in all of my early videos in the first year, I'm talking about vasopressin,
Oh,
vasopressin. And a couple medical people popped in, only registered nurses popped in and said, do you mean vasopressin? And they were all from the UK. So I said, well, I don't know. Maybe that's how they pronounce it over there. Only in recent times have finally I've learned to pronounce it correctly. But that is how few people out there are talking about your work, is
yeah.
people don't even know how to pronounce it. And that's so
Yeah.
important. So please share with us a little bit more. You mentioned that oxytocin and vasopressin are actually linked together and that they are in that pathway. I loved in the part of one of your papers when you were talking about vasopressin and oxytocin, how oxytocin can sometimes bond into those receptor sites because they are so intimately linked. It's the
Oh,
same pathway.
yes.
Tell
And
me a little bit more about these systems, how they came to be. Please unfold the knowledge.
right. Well, as far as we know, how they came to be is even older than those two molecules. Probably it started, the story starts about, oh, 450 million years ago. No, let's make it longer. 4.5 billion. Let's go as far back as we can imagine living organisms. And we had to survive in the face of challenge and stress. And we would have been single cells or very simple organisms. And always there are processes in place that allow us to adapt. Now, vasopressin, as I've learned it, is not the only name for this particular hormone. So I can do a quick little biological background for you if you'd like. So what happened was two molecules were found in the pituitary gland. They were identified over 100 years ago, but not at all understood. One of them seemed to be critical for fluid balance, for water, for managing the kidney, and that's vasopressin. And that's the older, more primitive, at least, molecule. Vasopressin and oxytocin had a common ancestor, and that's the part of the story that goes back, however, you can pick your numbers, however many millions of years. The reason they're so important is because we're terrestrial, and meaning we live on land, and we had to develop adaptations to manage water. Even if we lived in water, we would still have water problems. So vasopressin is extremely fundamental. As animals got bigger, they needed to pump fluids around the body. They developed complex cardiovascular systems. Um, all of that has been in place from way before there were any mammals. What happened with mammals and what makes us unique is we developed a way of not only not just laying eggs like most reptiles do, but actually taking care of our offspring. And the first thing we, if you will, our bodies developed capacity for, I started to say learn, but this isn't learned. None of this is learned. This is biology playing itself out. So we have these amazingly adaptive systems that allow us to go from water to land, that allow us to survive under different conditions on land. But those same molecules then were co-opted, meaning borrowed and used by the reproductive systems that we have, which included, in the case of females, having the baby experience or the egg turned into a pregnancy and going through birth. And in the case of mammals, we did a lot of the nurture of the offspring before birth. But at the time of birth, we needed a special mechanism. That's where oxytocin comes into our story. We needed to add a special mechanism to get the baby to the outside of the mother, birth, we call it, and to then nurture that baby in give it nutrients, food, lactation. So we had that new way of doing things that made mammals special, actually, allowed us to have babies with big brains, big heads, but not too big. Everything's kind of got to be just right. And then the important part that will relate to your world of attachment, we needed to be pretty sure that the baby we were mainly taking care of was our own. So our species, especially big mammals like us and sheep and goats, actually attach to the baby they've just given birth to if they can. They can attach to others too. So this is not only mothering, but motherhood became a kind of special relationship. And in mammals, that relationship is supported by oxytocin and vasopressin, not just oxytocin alone. So we had a molecule they're very similar, oxytocin and vasopressin. They only have 9 amino acids and only 2 are different. So what you have is a kind of symbiotic, or you have a kind of sibling relationship, one capable of supporting nurture, that's oxytocin, the other more involved in defense of the baby in the case of the mother, and in the case of fathers, which are really kind of interesting situation, we have also a defense sometimes of the mate, of the partner, not in all species, but in the highly social species like humans, we defend our partners if we can. And we have to anticipate, let's say this is way back in human history, hunter-gatherers, there were no real marriages, but there were certainly attachments and relationships. So no paperwork, but lots of attachment. And those relationships were defended by both the male and the female. But I'll let you ask more questions now. But the main thing that makes this interesting and a little bit scary is that vasopressin is an androgen-dependent molecule, meaning that in the brain where it's made, that's in an old part of the brain, its production is higher in males than females. And if that happens in early life, that sexual differentiation, that dividing of the sort of male pattern of vasopressin versus female. So we have something that's adaptively allowing one member of the species, the so-called male, the producer of sperm in the classic sense, to engage not just socially with the partner, but also try to defend that partner. And somehow vasopressin got both jobs for the male, especially. Males use oxytocin too. We can talk about that, but that's how I see these molecules. They're ancient, they are adaptive, they can change, but they're also regulated in part by hormones, especially sex hormones.
That is helpful. Thank you so much. And one thing I love from this is calling it out that they cannot really be separated. This is a big challenge that I have when I talk about on my channels. I talk about, okay, ladies out there, you might be bonding through more experiences that are more in tune with oxytocin connections. Wonderful. Men will need vasopressin bonding experiences from you for them to have that fullness and richness of experience.
Yeah,
And when I say this, women just light up and they say, and they pull out their notepads and say, tell me how to do it. What are 15 ways I can make him vasopressin bond? And then they say, well, okay, if he's only getting vasopressin, he's not getting any oxytocin. I say, whoa, 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 wait a minute.
no,
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 no, no. Tell me about that a little bit, if you would, please.
yeah.
Help me
Well,
set everybody straight there.
if we take blood samples and just look at oxytocin, there's usually a bias with females having a bit more, but males have lots.
Mhm,
And it's doing other things I'll tell you about in a minute, way beyond reproduction.
mhm,
But at the time of reproductive activities like birth and nursing the babies, the mother does have lots more oxytocin. She is abundantly producing that molecule. And it is part of the process, as far as we can tell,
mhm.
that causes her to specifically attach to whatever baby she's getting at that time.
And I have seen this effect. So my wife and I have 5 children, and all of them naturally birthed. And every single time she gives birth, and she's holding this little thing that looks like some kind of a monkey lizard, and she always looks at me and she's like, she almost looks drunk, and she goes, "Isn't he beautiful?" And she
Yeah,
like almost is crying, and I'm like, and I say, "There's the oxytocin,"
yeah,
and
that
that's that
is a
feature.
good guess that if there is a comparatively pure oxytocin experience, it's birth. And you vasopressin can actually cause uterine contractions, but it doesn't give you the beautiful waves and pulses you need for what you called a natural birth. So women, it appears from the literature that women who have premature births are actually, some of that's vasopressin acting, but it's usually preceded by stress or what they call preeclampsia, birth, all kinds of physiological problems that have caused the fetus to essentially say, I'm getting out of here. I may not be full term, but I'm leaving. I'm leaving this place. And those births are more problematic, and they're often, people who've studied this will tell you that it can be harder for a mother to bond to a baby if she hasn't had the privilege of a full term pregnancy. She'll
Yes.
still bond. We can bond to rocks. We can bond to trees. We don't need feedback, but especially if we're in a physiologically open situation. But what's cool about this is that the father, if he's around at the time of birth, is also producing oxytocin when he sees a baby. Hopefully it's his baby, but doesn't have to be. Babies are so powerful that they can elicit the release of oxytocin in males too. So you've got, again, a very adaptive situation. But what we don't know in humans, but we can talk about in other species like prairie voles, which I spent most of my career working with, under those conditions, the male has as soon as he mates with the female, he has to wait 21 days before his babies are born. That's really only 3 weeks. That's not too long. But he is in a state of defensive aggression at that time toward strangers. Now, prairie voles are really model um, partners, I guess we'll call them, or spouses, because they never attack their spouse. I've never seen in all the 40 plus years we've studied them, but they will attack strangers after they've mated. So they know at the time of mating, they develop the first version of this bond. And they don't even have to mate. They can just spend some time with a female if they're in the right state. And what happened is vasopressin's released. It's it's a kind of rapid maturation. So as the male mates with the female, he's also going through a kind of last stage of puberty, you could say. So he's preparing to be a father. And in that state, in nature, in those animals, it's very, very important that the male and eventually the female too defend the babies, because there are a lot of animals in their world, like other rodents, cats, just about anything will eat a baby vole if it can get a chance to, any larger animal, birds. And so dad and mom have work to do. They have to hide the babies under grass. They make little simple nests. Dad makes the nest, and that's probably vasopressin also. Part of it's like building a home. And then mom hypothetically deposits the babies. In fact, we've even seen the males help with the birth, do kind of midwifing. If they're present when mom starts to give birth, they'll actually lick the babies, take the babies. And in fact, in prairie voles, the males are as good at taking care of the offspring as the females are. We can count how much time they'll spend. They are equal parents. And both males and females have to go out to find food. So there's no food in the nest. And so they take turns. It's quite lovely, really. But the male has a little extra of this vasopressin process because he also may have to defend them against predators. He may have to defend against other males from other places who aren't the father. It's a beautifully designed system. Extrapolating to humans, I leave that to you to do. But
Well, extrapolating to humans with the bonding, I've been present for the births of all 5 children, and while yes, they may look a little bit like monkey lizards, I still adore them, and I'll never forget that the very first birth, I had no idea what I was doing, and we had the most wonderful RNs and OBGYN, and I remember they put the baby on mom immediately for skin to skin contact, and then they gave her the first feeding, and then they walked over to me and said, "Okay, take off your shirt," and I went, "Excuse
oh,
me?" They said, "Take off your shirt. You're going to do skin to skin bonding with your baby." And
wow.
I said, "But I don't have milk." And they said, "No, no, no, no. You need the skin to skin bonding so that both of you bond really effectively with each other. The baby will also pick up immune things from your chest hair, but the baby will smell you and feel you and bond with you. So here's a blanket." And I remember they wrapped me up with my son, and I remember holding him. I'm getting a little choked up almost thinking about it, but I was holding him and just feeling that bonding, and it was like, oh, you just felt this warmth just saturate through your being, and it was an
Yes.
overwhelming
And that
experience.
truly is what people think oxytocin feels like.
Hmm.
It increases warmth. It increases some kind of almost transcendent psychological state that's hard to describe. And again, you don't have to be a mother, you don't have to be a father. The amazing thing about human babies, even though you said they look like little monkeys sometimes, they are in fact almost irresistible.
Yeah, they are.
Unless you're in a pretty psychologically bad place, a baby will attract you.
Hmm.
And that is part of why humans were so successful as a species. We have, we have lots of helpers, not just mom and dad. But it's probably the males who are most likely to do physical defense of the baby.
And that makes sense because that's primarily how it seems like anecdotally how men seem to bond is by facing challenges, by teaching, by
Yeah,
reducing stress together as a team. You have to go out and hunt, you have to go out and fight, you have to go out and defend, and the males that you defended with would be your best buddies. We see
right.
this in buddy cop movies where they start hating each other at the beginning, they fight off the bad guys, and by the end they still tease each other, but now they're friends
Yeah.
because they've done that bonding
No,
together.
and it's what we're finding as the story unfolds, and it's a work in progress for the whole field, not just me, that the more difficult a situation is, the more likely it is to produce a rapid social bond. So people who want to bond with others, doesn't matter what gender, what sex, um, if they go do something together that's challenging, like jumping out of an airplane, or they used to have these dating shows. I don't know if they're still on TV, but what they would do deliberately is put people under a great deal of stress. Uh, this may or may not be the best way to pick your mate, okay? Because you're not using that other part of the brain, the rational brain. You're really depending on an emotional old system that, frankly, isn't very discriminating. So if you want to get a bad relationship going, just go do something really stupid and dangerous with someone else, and then cross your fingers that it's going to last, because all the other realities of life kind of click in. And yes, you've got that first start, but you haven't got the substance to keep the relationship going. And I'm sure that's what the people listening to this and the people you counsel have had to deal with. So they form a really fast, inappropriate bond with someone that seems perfect just for a few minutes. But
Yeah.
then what happens next is what matters. So in my case, I have had the same husband for 54 years. And I can assure you that that is a miracle, okay? Because there's so much that happens in life that we have to deal with. We have to accommodate the other person, they have to accommodate us. We have to go through periods when we're not very happy with something that's happened. Maybe it's the other person's fault, maybe it's not, but it's very normal to blame whoever's around for how you feel at the moment. And so we have a set of molecules that are there to try to keep us together. Some people argue long enough to get the baby out of the house. And in the early days, that would have been like 7 years. In other words, you need that relationship. Helen Fisher, who writes a lot about this topic, says in, she's an anthropologist. In other cultures, the average duration, at least historically, of a relationship was 7 years, the so-called 7-year itch. At that point, the baby was big enough to kind of take care of itself. And depending on what had happened in between, it might be an only child or there might be others following. Then you could either have a family or you could have mother, father, and one child, and the relationship could dissolve. but at least that first baby got enough parenting and enough support from two parents, ideally, or a group. Um, Again, grandparents, neighbors, siblings. You know, there's a wonderful old book by Hillary Clinton called It Takes a Village, based on the kind of African practice of everybody pitching in. So the basic relationship, according to Helen's point of view, has to be there long enough, or ought to be there long enough to get the babies some safety, some security, and some maturity. And then what happens after that is really, and that's where you, as a therapist or a counselor, come in. What happens next is what makes this challenging, I think.
I was just going to say that the research is fascinating on this. Some of the other research I've seen says that one of the best indicators for a good bonded relationship that will last long term is if they've done activities that might help promote vasopressin. If you have good
Well,
vasopressin throughout your relationship, your brain does seem to say, okay, let's stay together. Let's make this work because we are resolving stress together. We're an effective team. Why
yeah,
break up a good team? And
very
you can
well
resolve
put.
it quickly. I've seen
I,
that quite a bit myself. My wife and I, we've been married for 15 and a half years, and we have endured a lot of stress and difficulty together, obviously, as you and your husband have. As you know, you have to build that together continuously, but refreshing that bond that reminds you that you're an effective team, that does seem to prevent you from wandering off and finding someone else.
yeah, and some cultures make it very, very difficult for either member of the partnership to get away, to wander off. Probably adding to this stress, but also um, kind of taking into account the reality of life, which prior to modern times, we could not, one person couldn't build a house or a place to live. Um, I just visited a kind of a recreation of an indigenous village here. I live in Florida, and there you could see the structures were recreated, but they were a lot of work. You had to gather all of these palm fronds. You had to find strong strong materials. No one person could survive, at least in a settlement. The hunter gatherers had a different way of doing business, but even there, then I think the bond between the parents or the family was even more important. Because if you weren't in a settled one place and you were wandering the planet, you needed to have something secure with you. And that something ideally was another human who shared your goals or your interests and who had this invisible bond. See, what makes bonding fascinating, I think, is we can't see the bonds. We can't even define them with our modern brain. We're we're stuck in the old brainstem before words existed. We're having experiences that mice, these prairie voles that I study have, that predate everything we understand about learning and memory. Uh, we were developing these bonds, attachments. And it's not a surprise, by the way, that it took a long time, really within the last 20, 30 years, for people to appreciate how important social bonds were. They knew them intuitively, but they weren't verbalized. They were formalized by culture, by things like marriage or different relationships, right? But um, they weren't easy to explain. Constructs like love, ooh, I've gotten into so much trouble because of people calling oxytocin the love hormone. There's a, you know, because that's something we can't understand. So people became obsessed, often obsessed by love, and not know what it was, how to
This is a major problem I've had when I've tried to talk about these bonding hormones. Is a lot of women will say, "Well, I don't think he loves me." Oh, okay, well tell me why you don't think he loves you, and they'll say, "Well, he doesn't," and they'll begin listing behaviors
right.
that a male would do when he's flooded with, particularly with oxytocin, and they say, "Well, that means he doesn't love me," and I say, "Well, wait a minute." What other
Mm,
things is he doing that might be interpreted as care, nurturing, maintenance,
right.
defense, protection in other ways? One thing from your work that I've been curious about, and I'd love to hear a little bit more, is this concept that, if I get this right, please let me know, that oxytocin reception in the brain often does depend quite a bit on the level of cortisol happening at the time. That maybe if the male is overwhelmingly flooded with cortisol, he may not oxytocin bond, but he may still vasopressin bond. Is that true?
Well, you're asking a question it's very hard to be sure about.
Those are my
Both,
favorites.
yes, any kind of stress seems to increase both binding of both oxytocin and vasopressin. But there's a time course, okay? And what happens next is what's important. It's sort of like in your world, what happens after the wedding is what matters. The wedding is going to be exciting. There are going to be stress hormones always if somebody's putting on a production of some kind of ceremony. But then what happens next is I can tell you the physiology of it from animal studies. They weren't what I expected. And it's taking me even, I've been working on this for 40 years, really trying to understand it because, to back up a little, to take information out of laboratory studies and animal studies, what you get are fragments. You don't get the whole story ever, because you don't know where to look, you don't know what to measure. That's even more true of humans. We don't have a full sense of what's going on. But in the animal work, what we found early, really early, being the 90s, was that stress hormones actually increased oxytocin receptors in parts of the brain involved in stress. So, what I think happens, and vasopressin also very sensitive to stressful experiences. So, they tend to come at the time of a very intense stress, and we can talk about what's known, even exercise. Exercise is a pretty good way, intense exercise, to elicit the release of both oxytocin and vasopressin at the time or right around the time of the exercise. But then what happens, right? If if those stress hormones stay high and you don't have a period of recovery, then the system is different. It's disrupted if it's too long. Bonds that started to be formed may be disrupted. So if you wanted to fast forward millions, hundreds of millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, depends on when you think humans evolved. Let's say 300,000 years. People like numbers. I like numbers. Um, well, we had to take those old systems and use them in appropriate ways that would allow us to survive and reproduce. There are two laws of nature. One, you've got to survive first. And if you want your genes to move forward to the next generation, you'll have to reproduce or support reproduction in a close family member or something of that sort. All right. How are we going to do that? Well, we can't just every time something bad happens, shut down our bonding system. We don't do that. we, just as you said, we crank it up. The military knows that. They put people through extreme exercises, so-called boot camps and basic training. They'll put them under conditions that are, in some cases, life-threatening. And out the other end of that, if the person gets through it emotionally, doesn't break up, sort of fall apart, out comes a hypothetically stronger person and a hypothetically stronger set of bonds. So I used to live in Washington, and on weekends we'd go down to the mall, the I don't know, it's still called the mall, I guess, a big area where they had a monument for all different periods of wars. One of them, the Vietnam War, a lot of people, especially this was started you lived there 20 years ago, people would come there and find their friend's name on the monument. The Vietnam Memorial is just a series of names. They would find their friend's name, and these mature men, often fairly old, would break out in tears because they still had an attachment to someone they had met in 1973 or whatever, who had been lost at that time or died. So that was a serious form of bonding that most of us don't want to have to experience, but we can take. People used to say, how can I form a bond? Actually, almost every time I would sit down in an airplane, the person next to me, if I didn't know them, would ask, what do you do? And if I wanted to talk to them, I would kind of do a little quick confession. And then they would always ask me the same question. Most people apparently flying on airplanes don't have good relationships. That's just an observation. And they would say, how can I have better social bonds? I've just broken up with my girlfriend, or I've got a problem with my wife. What could I do? So I would always just tell them one thing. I'd say, go to an amusement park and take a roller coaster ride together. And, or something that you really find both exciting and pleasant. You don't want it to be too severe because the system will kind of flip over to survival mode and self mode rather than other. But if it's a reasonable event, whatever it is, with a good outcome, then the chances are you will actually, for at least some period of time, feel closer to whoever you were with at that time. And again, doesn't have to be a person of the opposite sex, doesn't have to be the right age. It's just a relationship is forming. So take your grandchildren to the roller coaster. Um, something useful.
This is good because about, just for reference, about 75% of the people who watch this channel are women who are eager to bond with men in their lives. Now, because I'm the attachment specialist, we focus a lot on avoidant men, avoidantly attached men, and women who are more what they would say anxiously attached or preoccupied anxious versus dismissive avoidant men. And a lot of these women are exactly like that, seeking information. So when they say, okay, Adam, you've told me that men are more receptive with vasopressin. Wonderful. What do I have to do? Do I have to start an international war and go to war with him to try to make that happen? Do I need to stress him out? Should I pull a knife on him next time that we're on a date? And I say, absolutely not. Please no. But things as simple as, renovate your house together, repair something together, take a class together. Yeah, it is. But go to a dance class together and learn dancing, learn cooking, learn martial arts. Have him teach you something, teach him something. Exhibit a little bit of stress, bring stress in, and then resolve it together. Even something as simple as, instead of going to the same restaurant you've gone to for 20 years, go to a new restaurant, a little bit of stress, and then talk about the experience, share it, face a wild new restaurant experience together, and then oxytocin and vasopressin bond while you're there.
Yeah,
And it can be so simple.
I think you're right. And if you think again in historical terms, life was very complex. Imagine a couple on the prairie. They got there in a wagon train. They might have been attacked by some local natives who didn't appreciate them coming through. Um, they very likely were repeatedly forming bonds. But if it gets too hard, too difficult, that it's a sweet spot. Attachment's a kind of finding the place where you can both have the experience, that's why the roller coaster is a simple example, but not die from it, not even feel you're going to die, because there's quite a difference in how the body manages completely uncontrollable stress and stress that we feel is resolvable or is resolved. And again, it's not a thing to play with. The problem here is even renovating a house, which really sounds like fun, except whenever I've done it, it usually went pretty far past the optimal point. Um, so if you're taking a modern approach where you hypothetically have control over your life, that's pretty hypothetical. Doing things together that are just in that range where both partners feel some security, but also the excitement is important. I like your idea of doing new things together. Now, some men, I know quite a few, for whom novelty becomes a little too much. Okay, um, they don't want to go to a new restaurant. They only want to go to the old one because there they'll know the waitress, or they'll know whether to tip or not, or what to order. Um, it's not easy. It's what makes us human, that we can adapt though to these things, and if we can also take the long view, not the short view, that's I think that's maturity. But it's also hard to remember that it's all going to be okay. Let's say somebody gets sick in your family. That's as big a stressor for me as possible to have. And you can't control it. How do you deal with it? That, I think, there, an outside party, a therapist, a wise relative is very helpful, because you may be so close. We get so close and so stuck in our own traumas, our own fears, that it's very difficult to pull back and say, oh, this is going to pass. That's the thing I always told my children, this will pass. And it did, sure enough. It always passed. But when you're in the midst of it, that's a time when it's really, I'm not sure bonding is actually the right word when you're in the midst of a crisis. It's afterward, maybe almost instantly afterward, that we need other, and that our body demands this kind of cocktail. And that's what oxytocin and vasopressin are. They're literally cocktail, mixed in different ways for different circumstances.
Okay. There's an idea I've been toying with a little bit. I'd love to run it past you and see what you think of it. Is, you mentioned earlier that humans in the old times, they didn't really have words or concepts for the things. They understood that the things were there, but they didn't have a word for it, or a marriage specifically, but they did have the bonding elements. They were wordless. They didn't even need to be named, really, because everybody understood them and felt them intuitively. I'm wondering a little bit if that might be what happens when in a relationship. The research says renewing the vasopressin bond so often keeps a couple together, and you get vasopressin when you face a stressful situation or a new situation together, and men are resistant to that, so we get very settled. We want to eat the same hamburger every day for 200 years in a row, and we're very happy with that. And I wonder a bit if that's something that women are intuitively doing and picking up on. Is we are getting no vasopressin during these experiences. We're getting not none, but we're getting mostly oxytocin. We are not facing stress. We are not facing difficulty. Everything is so smooth that we are not renewing our bonding properly. If we hit a big rough
It's a good
patch,
point.
he will leave me because he won't be programmed to turn toward me and defend, to protect, to work with. So he might leave. So I will say, honey, we're stuck in a rut. Why don't we try something new? And he goes, oh, I don't know about that. A new restaurant? She says, it's okay. We'll get through it. And they go to a new restaurant, and he's mortified. But you know what? They get through it. A little bit of vasopressin bonding, and then it renews the vasopressin bond every so often. I'm wondering if women in that innate wisdom are renewing vasopressin on purpose, dragging the
Well,
stodgy old man out of his home. Do you think that's possible?
I think it's a good idea. I don't know how often it's successful, but it certainly it it's plausible and it's biologically sound. But again, we here's part of our problem with stress. Our bodies are tuned to try to anticipate stressful experiences. We have a whole lot of systems, including learning, but biological systems where we try to accurately approach or appraise the future. So it's like buying a house or investing in stocks, something like that. At the same time, the body is trying to optimize. Okay, even if you aren't thinking about it, we're always engaged in a kind of optimization of how much stress we can handle, how much novelty we can handle, how much new excitement is possible. Um, there were, I don't know what's going on in the field now because I'm certainly not in your field, but there were people, very conservative women. The one I remember her name was Phyllis Schlafly, and she was extremely conservative. But what she was trying to do, at least politically, what she was trying to do is teach women to be more exciting for their husbands. Now, the feminists of that period didn't care much for Phyllis because it was all about men and they felt this should be a more equal partnership. But it, it wasn't such a bad idea. It just wasn't really equally um, administered. And then the other thing, though, that's happened is that we've forgotten that, and it's in our good interest to forget this, that a lot of our nervous system was tuned when we were children. It was tuned by the kinds of relationships we saw, the amount of stress we experienced, and we now have, some people are arguing we're too protective of our kids. And I think there's some truth to that, the helicopter parents who are trying to protect their children from everything. So the child doesn't, in a sense, build the psychological muscle they need to deal with excitement later, or to use this other system that's very sophisticated and knows what to do if you give it a chance, but you can't push it. So if I'm a person who's had a lot of bad experiences in early life, let's say, I may really not be able to tolerate having a piece of chicken when I'm used to beef. You know, I just have to take, I have to keep as many things same, similar, or constant as possible just to stay on a level keel. And I know that enters into marriages all the time, and it's always changing. And it's also threading a needle through this reproductive biology we have, which is pretty scary, frankly. We aren't, I used to direct something called the Kinsey Institute, and um, that was an experience. But I mean, talk about excitement. Um, but I realized I went there with the same research questions I still have. And then I realized, oh, this isn't actually what most people are interested in. They're interested in things that are what we would call sexual, or um, things that are not always sanctioned by society. It's different times, different places. I mean, I lived through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Each of those eras had a whole different way of looking at relationships, frankly. Um, and there's no one right answer. That's why biology is so beautiful. If you think at that level, you don't get stuck in the cultural stuff, and you can start to go to think about these problems more in the context of what's it doing to my body? How is it changing how I feel? And those are the kinds of introspective questions that I think cross generations, they cross gender, and but we're not able to teach them very well. We don't have a good, in my opinion, a good grasp on emotion. We don't have a good grasp on why we have what makes us feel safe, what versus what's creating danger or fear. And so we're in this, again, interesting time. I'm sure I will not be here to see it, but I'll be very curious to see, even 30, 40 years into the future, how marriage is doing, how kids who've gone through various kinds of gender transforming experiences, how are their lives coming out, what's going on, because the old biology is still there. And we are now manipulating it with our culture, with our diet, with hormones. We're in such a period of exploration and experimentation without precedent. So there'll be plenty of business for you, Adam. I can guarantee you that.
I know that. I almost wish it weren't so. The research on attachment issues is definitely proving that true. Of they with the baby boomer generation, they said that there was about 35% of baby boomers had probably some insecure attachment issues where they weren't bonding effectively for various reasons. And then they said the Generation X and Generation Y and the millennials, that whole pocket group in the middle, they indicate seems to be about a 50-50, where half of them have successful, healthy, I shouldn't say successful, but healthy, secure attachment, and the other 50% are insecurely attached. So now with Generation Z that's coming up, the oldest members are 23 years old. The research says they're about 65% insecurely attached and only 35% are securely attached. So this bonding hormone experience that you're talking about is more important than it has ever been. The work that you're doing is more important than ever. We need to know it so that they can start implementing it on purpose. The old systems that used to bond us correctly was we'd be in our village gathering the palm fronds for our house, hunting, defending, fighting off a wolf or something like that together. We don't necessarily experience those as much. We've siloed off into single person apartments, DoorDash, you get food delivered, you have Netflix, you work from home, you may not see another human being for 6 months. And that's becoming more and more what humans are doing. So they're dating long distance, you're dating someone through a screen. They write to me every day. How do I bond with my long distance boyfriend? Things like this. So it's the old biology needs to be made intentional. We need to understand the bonding chemicals. That's exactly why I wanted you on here today. It's been wonderful. But the old has to become the new so that we can continue to thrive wherever we go
Well,
next.
and to get the hard part here, and it just really hit me recently, is that the cortex, which we're so proud of and allows us to do all the things you just mentioned, is new. And the real essence is down in the brainstem. If you use your fist as a model for the brainstem, cortex is up here. You can take the whole cortex off, at least in animals. And most of the essential life necessary things continue, including, at least for females, mating. But it's we don't understand it because the understanding part of our brain was added later. And the information is coming up from this brain stem. And the cortex, it interprets it based on our life experiences, education, just everything. But it doesn't always get it right because the language of the brain stem isn't words, it's feelings. And we are working in that domain, whether we're the newest generation or not. But this thing I mentioned earlier about how all of life's experiences are, it's a kind of calculus, a kind of factoring in new stuff all the time. All of those matter. So people raising kids, the more experiences they have, frankly, the better off they are. Even if some of those experiences are what you called vasopressin bonding experiences, or even negative experiences, they're growth experiences, they're ways to move to the next level and to get stronger. You can't build a muscle without using it. We know
That's what our
that.
ancestors created those rites of passage for, was to initiate stress and then get you through it together as a
Yeah,
community. And then you
they
were
did. Every culture, and we still have rites of passage, but they're not as social as they used to be, as you just pointed out. And of course, the pandemic didn't help uh, because it created long periods of isolation or small group, very, very small group interactions. And this electronic substitute, which is all cognitive, very bits of it can get into our brainstem, but not some of the most important things like touch, odors. It's a visual. It's visual. The visual cortex is new compared to the parts of the brain that regulate emotion. So it's so, if you think in those terms, things that seem very complicated may actually be simpler than we realize. But we haven't thought them through, in my opinion, again, very well.
and maybe we're not supposed to, like you said, the part of your brain that thinks things through, maybe you're not supposed to necessarily just think it through in the moment. When I work with my coaching clients, that's something I tell them is you will never fix your attachment, your nervous system, your bonding. You will never fix any of that by thinking, because you're not supposed to. You are supposed to have experiences. The goal of the working together is to build you the experiences you need. Then it reprograms your systems over time, and we work through those. Yes, we can talk about them. Yes, you can think about them, but you have to have those experiences, or it is for nothing. You will simply
That's
sit in
right.
a room for
Very,
100 years thinking.
very well put, because we're living in a time when there are people with almost no real experiences. That's what you're telling me, and I hadn't quite thought about it that way. But I'm afraid it's true. There's a subset of people who are living virtually, And that means they're only getting stuff filtered through this cortex. It's meant to be filtered through the brainstem. As you're a child, you're mostly a brainstem. And then you add cortical layers and experience. It's a fascinating field. It's a fascinating time.
I agree. I think that we're going to see some interesting things going forward. I think that the young generations will reinvent marriage. They'll call it something new. They'll be proud of their accomplishment of having invented marriage. They'll call
Right.
it something completely else and say, "Guys, we came up with the best idea." But it will serve a purpose in a new way. It will look different somehow. It will serve their needs at the time. It will
Yeah.
bond appropriately. It will care for children in the way children will need to be cared for. I think that everything will be refreshed. I don't think it's going to I don't think we're going to enter in a golden age or a utopia. I don't think that's coming. I don't think humans are made for that. But I do think that we are going to invent ourselves much more intentionally than we have in the past. I think it's time. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. I will say one more time, when I discovered your work, it really opened my eyes to these possibilities. It's helped me help so many other people. I have over 500,000 followers now who listen, and most of it, a tremendous amount of it comes from your work. So thank you for what you're doing. It is some of the most important work on the planet.
That's very kind. And it does make all the, decades seem like they were perhaps even worthwhile. Uh, Thank you.
I
Thank you.
absolutely
It's
thank you.
been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For everybody at home who wants to find more about you, where can they look? What would be the best place if they want to learn more about your work?
My CV, my resume is on the Kinsey Institute website. Um, to be honest, it's probably not up to date, but that's the easiest place. And I have a professional email address there too, but I
Wonderful.
don't have time to monitor it very well. So, and I'm not a therapist. Sadly, you'll have to contact Adam if you want therapy, because I don't have that experience. But yeah, putting these things together, that's quite a fun task in a way, isn't it?
It
It's
is wonderful.
intellectually interesting.
And I will
Go
link at least one of your papers down below. One of the papers that transformed my work and my life. I'll put that down below in the description for anyone who wants to read more immediately. It
on.
was a foundational paper I think should be absolutely required reading for Psychology 101, to be honest with you. So there we go.
My website with all those has lots of open access reviews and papers that are embedded in my CV. So you can just go through and push a button and hopefully
Wonderful.
find most of them.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Carter, for sharing time with us today. Everybody at home, pop down in the comments section if you have questions or just things you learned from here today. I know you've been hungry for more information about oxytocin, vasopressin bonding. Please pop down there and we will hear from you again. Thank you so much.